Hi, my name is Nicholas Herriman, and in this presentation, which is entitled Seeking the State, I want to look at the way bureaucratic symbolism and wealth is appropriated by local populations in the margins of Southeast Asia. The research I'm presenting here has been undertaken by myself and Monica Winanita. The context is the state. The state, as in the government, if you like, the governments and the bureaucracy which runs civilization is born or begins in human history around this area, around Pakistan or probably further to the west, about 4,000 years ago. So the state, if you like, is a kind of Asian invention which has spread to the rest of the world. In the modern period, a lot of innovations in the state from about 1500 have occurred in Europe. And since in the last, let's say, 50 or 60 years, there have been different scholarly approaches to understanding this state, this form of human organization. Predominating among them is the analysis by Foucault, who has this idea of the art of government. It's pretty hard to put it succinctly because there are a lot of ideas around it, but I'll have a go. The idea is that we start to govern ourselves, that we have, if you like, a kind of internal surveillance which stops us, for example, running red lights in the middle of the night. And that is developed it's a kind of mentality which he calls a governed mentality, which has emerged from the state, and particularly through its programs which are ostensibly designed to improve our lives. So, for example, the state would have a large vaccination program, and in order to do that, the government will collect data about its citizens, their age, where they live, their weight, and so on. And all this information gives unprecedented levels of knowledge to the state, and also allows for new ways to, if you like, surveil or keep surveillance on the population, on people like you and me. So the vision is a little bit dystopic, but the idea is that the government has unprecedented levels of control and understanding over the population, and that we ourselves take part in or actively assist that through governing ourselves. Another approach, so Foucault is like a sociologist or philosopher. He's a big theorist, one of the most important thinkers in the past 50 or even 100 years. The other idea comes from an anthropologist by the name of James Scott, and he's come up with an idea which, though he doesn't explicitly critique Foucault, it seems to implicitly critique Foucault. It's called the art of not being governed. And what he suggests is that people, and he's referring only to Southeast Asia here, but we can broaden it, and other authors have broadened it, but in relation to Southeast Asia and Asia, in the hilly and mountainous areas of Southeast Asia, people retreat from state control and live lives outside of the control of the bureaucrats. So basically, what the coloured areas refer to this area where people have managed to escape state control and live in a form of anarchy, if you like, in the anarchy in the sense of no state control. Famously, the civilizations of Southeast Asia and Asia in general evolved around the great rivers of Asia, such as like the Ganges, the Indus River, the Yellow River, and so on. Whereas Zomia is highland areas, mountainous areas where people have been able to retreat. So that's the general idea. This is down here would represent, I think, for Scott, an area of state control. There's agriculture, there's civilization there, and people run away to the upper lands to escape taxes and control. So they're the two visions. One is of an all-encompassing state, and the other is of a state that people can escape from. What we want to pick up on and elaborate is a third vision, which we call Seeking the State. And in particular, we're looking at areas that I suppose would be like Zomia, as Scott called it, areas which are outside of state control. But in these areas, instead of trying to escape state control, it seems like the opposite phenomenon is occurring. Namely, people are attempting to seek the state, to bring the state into their lives. So they could turn their back on the state, but they do the opposite thing and seek out the state. So using this idea, we can reinterpret or interpret the work of other scholars and our own field work. I structured the presentation as follows. First, I'm going to define the state. Then I'm going to outline the art of government and the art of not being governed approaches in more detail. Then I'll look at other research on entanglements of state power in Southeast Asia. Following that, I'm going to present our own research findings, one from my first fieldwork site, Banyuwangi in East Java, where local residents seek to emulate and adopt the symbols and power of state surveillance and violence. Then I'm going to go to Cocos Islands, where Juanita and I have done research, where local residents seek state patronage. And then we're going to look at research that Juanita has done in Perth on Indonesian migrant women, dancers who adhere to state ideals of femininity in order to achieve status as cultural representatives in the Indonesian migrant community. So the main point we're going to make here is that people who are peripheral to state control seek to bring the state into their daily lives, but bring the state into their daily lives on their own terms. Try and come up with a definition of the state. Anderson defines the state as a form of institution, for example, similar to the church, if you think of the Catholic Church. Weber talks about bureaucracy, so we can see the state as a form of bureaucracy, that is a place with offices that are based on, ideally on merit, in theory on merit. You have records, written records, you have boards, you have meetings, those kinds of things. Weber also provides us with another definition, which is the state think of it as an organization or a body or an institution which can make a legitimate claim to a monopoly on violence. And basically what that means is if I'm drunk on the street and a bunch of thugs tie my arms behind my back and kidnap me or something like that, or hold me in their house, I feel angry and aggrieved because I don't feel that's legitimate violence. But if the police arrest me and put handcuffs on them and throw me in a cell, I'm not as angry because I perceive that violence that the police have perpetrated on me as being legitimate. So whatever this state is, it might not just be limited to things like government, schools, prisons, courts, etc. But it might also, and you probably get this from one reading of Gramsci at least, it might also permeate social institutions. So we might see evidence of the state in, like, say, a football club, which has a board of directors and meetings, but also, it might have a picture of the president on the wall. So you might see like a sports club as a part of the state as well. And that leads us to what Bourdieu talks about in 1999 as something that we are all implicated in creating and being part of. So in a sense, as we go through this, we get different kinds of angles or definitions of the state. More recently, like say in the past 30 years, another approach which emerged, which saw all these as, let's say, as chimeras, as kind of a fantasy or a phantom image that emerges in our mind, which is created by the state. Now, this is a bit weird, but the idea is that all those definitions I've given you are really just effects of the state, that the state has created this image of itself that we believe in that may not actually be true. So Arat Shaga, Abrams, Trulot, and people like this see the state as really a set of effects or a set of ideas in the population, which is really, as I said, just a set of ideas, not an actual body. So, for example, Graeber talks about this idea of the state possessing a monopoly on violence or the exclusive right to legitimately use force as an effect of the state, that the state makes us believe that. And this is, as Tausig says, precisely the kinds of fetishism that the state projects. So what I've done in these two slides is provide varying angles or definitions or understandings of the state. And part of the problem is that when we're talking about the state, we're often, as scholars, talking at cross purposes. We're not even talking about the same thing sometimes. So I'm going to limit the definition to something like in the first slide, an institution which is something like the church, which has bureaucratic forms such as record keeping, hierarchies, an ideal of merit, and so on. So maybe just this first 2 points. The other ones are not necessary for my argument anyway. So let's look now at this state and how it operates in Southeast Asia. And we'll start with Laos and the research of Holly Hai, an anthropologist who is currently, I believe, at the University of Sydney. And she looks at these Lao villages on an island in the Mekong River. You've probably heard of the Mekong River before, but it's very wide at points, wide enough to have an island. And the Laotian state, the state of Laos, offers plenty of programs or projects which are supposed to offer a way out of poverty. But when Holly Hai investigated these projects or analysed these projects, she found, for example, a road that went nowhere. There was a road that went nowhere, which was built on a small island without a bridge, or in another case, a rusting irrigation pump. So the state creates these projects which local people don't think or expect will be successful. But what they do like and what they're excited about is the wages that come from building the road that goes nowhere or the irrigation pump that gets rusty and other benefits that accrue. There's similar kind of findings coming from Andrea Walker, an anthropologist who does work in northern Thailand in a village called Banyuwangi. Their local residents seek out wealth and legitimacy from the state. They are engaged in trying to attract state funding for local projects, such as, for example, an organic fertilizer facility. These projects mostly fail, Walker finds, but they provide, quotes, the second most important source of employment. And local residents are always putting in funding applications and putting on big celebrations if they're successful. So what they're doing in both cases, it seems not in both Laos and Thailand, in these two villages that these researchers have looked at least, is not avoiding the state. And in fact, as Walker says, they're not avoiding the Thai state. In fact, they're trying to domesticate the state and bind the state or bring the state, embed the state in local practices. Timur is an anthropologist who's done work in it's actually, I think it should be Eastern Borneo, amongst the Bugis ethnic group. These people migrated from Sulawesi over to the east coast to an area where a big river meets the ocean, and they can build shrimp ponds. Now, this is what he defines as a frontier zone, and the state's presence is barely felt there. Yet, in the absence of a central state, local Bugis people try to bikin seperti negara, or act like the state. They try and create local state practices. So what they want, for example, is that their patrons will act like the state and follow the state's example of being generous and giving out funding or loans or being available for healthcare. So for these Bugis migrants, rather than seeking to disappear into the frontier areas as we'd expect from James Scott's Zomia model, they seek the legitimacy and munificence or generosity of the state. In fact, in one example, he talks about they try to create a form of documentation that represents the state's legal documents so that they can claim some sort of ownership over their shrimp ponds. It seems to me that what's going on in these cases is not a case of the art of being governed. There's not this sort of level of state surveillance, though perhaps a Foucauldian might argue that they are acting in a way that the states, they have a governmentality because they're trying to act like the state. But for me, that's adding too many layers of complexity into the analysis. I think when you have a simpler and clearer explanation, that this is generally preferable, and the simpler and clearer explanation in these cases is that the people are seeking out the state simply to achieve social status and wealth. Final research I'm going to consider is from Rupert Stash, an anthropologist who did research amongst the Korowai people of West Papua, which is part of Indonesia. So just to put it on the map, you've got Australia over here, Indonesia up here, and Papua New Guinea over here. And even though it's on the island of New Guinea, this is actually part of Indonesia. And what I call it is desiring the state, using Rupert Stash research. He talks about people who are traditionally hunter-gatherers situated in the hills and mountains of the frontier. Now, these are people who, I suppose, using Scott's idea of the art of not being governed, you would expect to turn away from the state and seek to hide from the state. But even though there are no local state officials monitoring them, their gaze is focused towards the state. So the Korowai people believe in witches, and they believe that there are witches living among them. Some of the people who belong to their group, witches. And in order to deal with these witches, they incorporate state violence in two ways. One way is mimicking state violence. For example, they use police techniques of torture and humiliation as a way of retaliating against witches. So they use the techniques that they associate with the police as a way to punish witches. They also actually go out and actively seek the intervention of police and army officers when they retaliate against witchcraft. So they actually go out and march or hike for 1 or 2 days to find the nearest state officials and invite them to become involved in the management of witches. So what they're trying to do there, I think, is strategically employ the state and particularly its powers and symbolism for their own purposes. So all this research, I think, shows a third way to look at the state that doesn't fall neatly into Foucault's idea of the art of government or into Scott's idea of the art of not being governed, because all of these places that we've looked at could be counted as peripheral areas, and yet these local residents are trying to bring the state in rather than escape from the state. To look at the way my research and Juanita's research shows how people emulate and seek to bring in the state. So I did my research in the far eastern edge of Java in a district called Banyuwangi. It's situated right next to Bali, a famous tourist destination. Even so, you could make the argument it's a provincial or even marginal area, being on the far away from the provincial capital, which is Surabaya up here. So I also looked at the killings of people who are suspected to be sorcerers. If my niece dies of, let's say, a swollen stomach, even though the doctors told her that she was suffering from hepatitis B and ascites or abdominal fluid swelling, the belief is that this and other misfortunes she might have had during her life were caused by me. And in order to stop me killing more people, her brothers and parents and my neighbours all gang up and kill me. Now, when they gang up and kill sorcerers, as they still do in Banyuwangi, there was one just a few weeks ago, and I'm recording right now in 2020. My research was done in 2002. When they gang up and kill sorcerers in the cases that I've researched, and there were over 100 of these, which occurred in 1998, often they would seek the assistance of local state officials. My nieces, brothers and parents and my neighbours and people who call themselves my friends go to the local village head or the local sub-village head or the neighbourhood heads and say, look, we've got to get rid of this Nicholas Harriman character. Are you going to help us? Sometimes the village heads would say nothing and not report it as they're supposed to. Sometimes they'd actually get out there and help the people kill the person. And then later if, for example, police got involved, they would help cover up. Also, it seems to be that not often, but in a number of cases I studied, the sorcerers, after they killed, so after my nieces, brothers and parents kill me, they would drag my body to the village offices. Every village has a kind of big square or yard, and offices in the middle where the village head and the sub-village heads gather. Should gather every day, but often they forget to. Anyway, they'd take my corpse there and string it up and maybe burn my corpse or something like that. And I think that's a way of trying to bring this form of what I call community justice into a kind of state's legitimacy. So bringing their own practices into the legitimacy of the state. The people I lived with tended to enthusiastically endorse principles of self-discipline and militarisms, which happened to be promoted by the state too. So they would join, for example, local village guards, which were kind of volunteer things, or even join the sort of paramilitary organisations associated with different parties. But when they did this, they weren't doing it to assist the surveillance of the central state, as you might imagine in a Foucauldian system. In fact, they're often working against the interests of the central state and in the putative interests of the community, like to protect the community from sorcerers and other people like thieves from outside the village. And you can see that, for example, in stickers people stick on their car, like I'm part of the big mobile brigade, police mobile brigade army, or special forces. People seek or sought, when I was doing field work at least, to emulate this kind of super violent power of the state. And so not only were they turning to local state officials to assist in sorcerer killings, but after the sorcerer killings, there was another phenomenon, let's say in 1998, where it was believed that there were ninjas, sort of supernatural martial arts practitioners running around the countryside, killing the good Muslim folk. In order to stop that, local residents set up roadblocks like the army, like the police, I should say, and they demanded people's KTP, which were like identity cards. So, in other words, they were sort of responding to it in a way that tried to mimic the way the state worked. So, in all these cases, it's hard to apply Scott's model of avoiding state control because they were looking towards the state. And it's possibly difficult to, I think it's more difficult to say that it's a case of governmentality, that the state has somehow imposed its values into the mentality or the ideas of local residents, because often the local residents were acting against the interests of the central state in, for example, killing sorcerers, because one of the big demands of the state is order and justice, or law and order, put it that way. So that's the case I studied in East Java. The second case I'm going to look at is from a place called the Cocos Keeling Islands, which are right out here in the northeast Indian Ocean. Now, Juanita and I researched there as a husband and wife team with our kids. So this island's a very, very interesting history, which I'll put up a link to later. But basically, 500 Muslim Malays there, they live there. They arrived with what's called White Raja. These are European men in the 1800s who sought to establish kingdoms for themselves in different parts of Southeast Asia. You might have heard of Raja Brooke, the Brooke dynasty in Borneo. Well, there was one that lasted even longer, and that's the Clunies Rosses, which were in the Cocos Islands up until the 1980s, when, after UN pressure, local residents voted to become part of an Australian state. This was called the Act of Self-Determination. Now, that act in itself is quite interesting because they had three choices, which was to go it alone, to have some sort of link with Australia, or become wholly and completely part of Australia. And they went for the latter option. They decided to be part of Australia and bring the state into their lives. So again, at the risk of being repetitive, this doesn't seem to fit the model that Scott offers of people seeking to escape the state in Zomia. To put it another way, maybe in highland Southeast Asia, people are trying to get away from the state, but in other marginal areas of Southeast Asia, it seems people are trying to seek or bring in the state. So it wasn't just this vote in 1984. Subsequent to becoming part of Australia, what the White King's kingdoms had run on coconut exports. But once the coconut exports stopped, there was no real employment. So as a result, since since becoming part of Australia, I should say, they were independent, possibly independent, and voted the other way to become incorporated into Australia. Australian states welfare has provided most of the health, education, and wealth. So it's quite a lot of money. I sort of calculated roughly when I was doing fieldwork about 167 million a year, which equates to about 83,000 per person per annum. That's not what's paid into their pockets, but all, if you consider all of the assistance and aid that the state is spending there. According to a local imam I spoke to who runs Centrelink, which is the state's welfare provider, about 60% of the population is on benefits. And it's not just benefits, but what employment there is for a large part of it is provided by the state. So local Cocos Malays have employment as teachers, assistants, as healthcare staff, school administrative staff working for Water Corp, that is providing water pumps. There is a lot of dissatisfaction though, because the top administrations, let's say the principal of the school here, and other professionals are not Cocos Malay but mainlanders. So there's a small population of mainlanders, and I'll just go back to this map here. On the West Island, there's a little village, or kampong, it's called, little area, which is settled mostly by about 200 people from the Australian mainland. But on Home Island, this is where about the 500 Muslim, more or less 500 Muslim Malays live. Although they enjoy the benefits of the state, they also feel at a disadvantage relative to the mainlanders. While they seek these values, while they seek this wealth from the state, they actually seek to insulate against mainland values. In other words, they're seeking to maintain their own culture and rituals. So in this photo is from a Cocos Malay wedding. A groom's party is arriving at a bride's place and is resisted by the bride's relatives. Weddings, for example, are large events that last for 7 days. There's a month of feasting before it at the bride and the groom's house, and local people complain that their weddings are just going overboard and costing more than 100,000. And in fact, while we were there was a sort of informal competition for the most lavish honeymoon on top of it. So people were going to world-class international resorts. So one of the things is that there's a lot of sort of spending money. There's not much to spend money on there, and people are very good at saving because they can go fishing in the lagoon and provide for a lot of their food there. And they live in large houses and share out the food very effectively, very clever. And we talked a little bit about these people in an article we wrote called their aim to be recognised as Indigenous Australians, like what are sometimes called Aboriginal Australians. And I mean, this is interesting too because they feel like this would be a way to empower them in relation to the state and give them a stronger claim for the benefits that the state provides. And I should say, I as a Australian academic understand this because I do research and I seek patronage of the state too. I put in claims for funding. I apply for funding like these Southeast Asian people, maybe from a different position, one of privilege, but at least in terms of seeking out the state, that's part of my life too. And in fact, when I was doing research, one of the problems I confronted was people on Cocos Islands thinking, well, why did you get money to research us? We could do just as good or better a job, and that would be employing local people. But the point remains that they are, although in a marginal area, seeking to bring the state in, at least the state's munificence or wealth and generosity into their life. The final case I'm going to look at comes from Juanita's research, which is done which was undertaken among Indonesian migrants living in Perth. Now, as migrants, they have the opportunity to become permanent residents and citizens of Australia, and some of them already are, I think. But they nevertheless congregate around the Indonesian consulate. And the question is why, when they have the opportunity to escape this state or move away from this state, they actually seek it out. Now, the ways they seek it out is, for example, in this dance which is called Unity in Diversity, which comes from the Indonesian emblem which says Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which means unity in diversity. So these people, these female performers, most of them housewives, actually all of them housewives, put on this dance. They created this dance called a tari kreasi, which they tried to encapsulate Indonesian values and display them towards the Indonesian community and the wider Australian multicultural community. And it's fascinating because you have people that wearing different, what's thought of as traditional clothing from different ethnic groups in Indonesia, using aerobic movements from the 1980s school camp aerobics campaign, and the Garuda, which is this mythical bird here, and a Papuan, what's thought as Papuan clothes from Papua, where we saw Stash did that research. So they're trying to encapsulate the whole unity and wonder of the nation and portray it to the Indonesian state in migration. In particular, they see acceptance of a group called the Ddama Juanita, which is a group for the wives of state officials who live in Perth, and for the Consul General too. So they seek the approval and acceptance of these people, but at the same time, they are stigmatized and sort of marginalized for this perception that because they married Australian guys, that they are bar girls. But they seek to eclipse that, to get beyond that, and be seen as professionals and perform like classically state-endorsed ideals of femininity. So they seek legitimacy not only for the state, but also for the Australian state too. And here they are with one of the provinces of Australia, Western Australia, with the Premier or the head of government, not nominally, in effect, in practically speaking, he's the head of government, the Premier of Western Australia. What they found was that doing this dance, which was from Madura, which is kind of folk dance, was much more effective. They gained much more acceptance because it was thought to be more appropriate for these housewives to be kind of flashy and showy, flamboyant and over the top. So it fitted better into the values they were trying to appeal to. Now, it might seem here that some of Foucault's ideas apply, and of course, my point here is not that Scott and Foucault are wrong. It's just that different patterns also emerge. So perhaps the state's ideas of femininity have been adopted by these women, who then serve them back to the state, seeking the acceptance of the consular staff and their wives. But there's also a case to be made that the state mimicked and adopted already pre-existing values about femininity. And in any case, in a practical, obvious way, these people are seeking to be accepted by the Indonesian state, even when they're in migration and a long way from state control of Indonesia, at least. So, for the most part, in the cases we've looked at, you don't see this sort of internalization of state surveillance, which Foucault talks about in terms of governmentality, nor do you see people seeking to escape the state. What is more dominant, I think, is a theme where people seek to form relationships with state officials, to emulate state imagery and authority, and to partake in the wealth and the status the state offers. Indeed, the general goal is to bring the state in.